when Chief Investigator Josep Perez arrived at the crime scene and spotted the burned-out VW Golf standing in the middle of a pine forest a little bit outside of Barcelona. His first suspicion was that this could be a case of gang crime. That is, until he learned that the vehicle is registered to 38-year-old police officer Pedro Rodriguez. It is May the 4th, 2017, 8 p.m. The forensics work is as good as done. The car key was recovered a little bit further on, but there is not much more to the car. But just as the towing service pulls up, one of the forensic experts suddenly notices a small, shiny, white object in the back of the car. At this very moment, the investigation into one of the most sensational murder cases in Spain in recent years begins, because what the forensic expert had discovered was a human bone fragment. My name is Holly and I welcome you to another episode of my podcast, The True Crime Cocktail Hour. This is case 2 of our video series, Deadly Women. Short intro video and then we get right into it with case 2, Lust, Passion and Murder, the crimes of police officer Rosa Peral. Okay, so it takes ages to recover the rest of the body as it is literally fused to the trunk. They also don't know who it is yet. It is also impossible to find out how or when this person died because there's barely anything left of this body. However, a small screw of the type used in intervertebral disc operations was found among the bone remains. And lucky to Perez and his forensic team, the serial number of this screw was still recognizable. A search of the database shows that only 2 people in the whole of Spain had a screw used in an operation, and one of them is police officer Pedro Rodriguez. So Chief Inspector Perez has a sample taken from Pedro's toothbrush and had sent it to the laboratory for DNA comparison. And in the meantime, he thought to himself, well, I might as well pay a visit to Pedro's girlfriend, who's also a police officer. So she lives less than 10 minutes away from where the car was found in a detached house with her 2 daughters. So when she stands in front of Chief Inspector Perez, leaning against the half-opened garden gate, and he tells her that they found a body in the burned-out car of her boyfriend, Perez at least expected tears or concern. Instead, he got the impression that she couldn't care less. He might as well have told her about his lunch and the reaction would be the same. But then she begins speaking. So she tells Perez that she and Pedro had been a couple for a little bit over a year now, but that he had fled the house a couple of nights ago after an argument. But that had happened before, several occasions, and he had always come back, which is why she did not report him missing. So as proof, she shows Perez her chat history with her boyfriend Pedro. And the last message is from Pedro, and it said, quote, "I will turn off my cell now. Sorry, I don't want to involve you in my problems." End quote. Well, that is interesting. What kind of problems? So Perez wants to find out, and so he reads through the employment files of Pedro Rodriguez, but also of his girlfriend, the police officer. Come to find out that Pedro Rodriguez really does have some problems. Pedro Rodriguez is currently suspended from duty. He's the subject of an internal investigation after he beat up a motorcyclist during a traffic stop who initially refused to stop. And honey, compared to his girlfriend, his employment file is relatively thin. And that brings us to Rosa Peral. Rosa Peral is 36 years old and she's a very attractive woman. She's slim, she's athletic, she has this long black hair. But she's also currently off duty because she suffers from depression and for good reason. So for starters, she's also under internal investigations. So here's what happened. A few weeks earlier, Rosa and another colleague of hers, they were driving around the city when they stopped to carry out an identity check on a homeless man. So allegedly, this homeless man all of a sudden rammed a knife into Rosa's thigh and ran off. So Rosa's colleague, he got up, he ran straight after him. He's trying to catch him. Now, according to the police report, this homeless man, in his attempt to flee from Rosa and her colleague, threw himself down a slope and he ended up dying from his injuries. However, the accident reconstruction showed that it could not have happened this way. This man had injuries that did not align with just rolling down a slope. Instead, it looked like this homeless man had been severely beaten and then thrown down this slope. So that's the one thing. The other thing is that Rosa is currently making headlines in the so-called porn revenge scandal. So at the end of their affair, a former superior of hers allegedly distributed photos around the entire police department that showed Rosa giving him oral sex. She filed a lawsuit against him and the trial is still ongoing. In general, Chief Inspector Perez has quite a difficult time figuring this woman out. Something about her is just off. First, her too cool of a reaction to these disturbing news, and then also the fact that she didn't even invite the officers in when they came to visit is quite odd. So one day, after the car was found, Rosa showed up at the police station to make her official statement. And again, she just seemed to be so super cool about everything. She told Perez that she spent the 1st of May, the day before Pedro's disappearance, with Pedro and her 2 daughters. They first went to her parents' house and then they had roast chicken in Pedro's garden. And as proof, she showed Perez a photo that she had taken of herself, Pedro, and the girls, just for him to see what a nice time they had. And Rosa's parents even claimed that they had seen Pedro on the 2nd of May, on the day of his disappearance. You know, Rosa and her affairs, this is how it all began, and it is such a juicy story. So she was married to the father of her 2 daughters for over 20 years, but the marriage isn't really going well, and so eventually she started hooking up with one of her colleagues from work, and this man's name is Albers Lopez. So Rosa and her ex-husband eventually got a divorce, and then she started seeing Albert. Although I have to mention at this point, it wasn't really a relationship. It was more like what the kids would call today a situationship. Nevertheless, Rosa broke things off with Albert 4 years later when she fell in love with Pedro. As different as the 3 men are, they have 2 things in common. They are very muscular, and all 3 of them are police officers. So Rosa first accuses her ex-husband of murdering Pedro out of jealousy. Turns out, though, that her ex-husband has an airtight alibi and has nothing to do with Pedro's murder. Then Rosa suddenly names Albers Lopez, her ex-affair, as a possible suspect. So Albert is interrogated. Oh, by the way, in case you were wondering, it is almost normal for police officers interrogating police officers. We already talked about the scandals and the corruption that's going on in the Spanish police force when we talked about the Lucia Garrido case last month, if you watched this video, and it is no different in Rosa's unit, the Guardia Civil. Her colleagues are constantly on trial for drug possession, violence against passersby and immigrants, and of course, corruption. Oh, and by the way, guess who the colleague is who is also under investigation about this homeless man and his mysterious death? So Albers Lopez initially makes a very solid impression on Perez. The only thing that leaves him a little bit stunned is the fact that Albers knows about the latest argument between Pedro and Rosa. He also told Perez that he spent the nights after Pedro's disappearance at Rosa's house. And then there's this other colleague of theirs who told Perez that the 2 of them showed up together at another colleague's birthday party 2 days after Pedro's disappearance, acting and looking like a couple. And then another 6 days later, the results of the cell phone analysis were available. Turns out that on the 2nd of May, not only Rosa's and Pedro's cell phone were logged into the cell near Rosa's house, but also the phone of Albert. Now, all of this combined is a huge red flag to Chief Inspector Perez. And even though Rosa's parents still claimed that they saw Pedro on the 2nd of May, that they talked to him and that he was fine, Perez, at this point, is pretty certain that at least one of them is lying, and that Pedro Rodriguez never saw the day of May the 2nd. So Perez applies for house searches and arrest warrants for Rosa and Albert. Officers find a prepaid cell phone at the apartment of Albert, and in Rosa's house, they find Pedro's cell phone, which is so stupid, but okay. And then they also find shoes with blood splatters on them. And when Perez increased the pressure on Rosas' father just a little bit, he suddenly collapsed and in tears confessed that he lied for his daughter and that he did not see Pedro on the 2nd of May. Rosa Peral and Albert Lopez were charged for the murder of Pedro Rodriguez. So the two of them are together on the docks, but sitting as far away from each other as humanly possible. They don't say a word to each other. Instead, they accused each other, testimony against testimony. Two versions of the same story, but which version is to be believed? Let's take a look at Rosa's version. Rosa meets Albert at work and they become a couple in summer of 2013, even though she is still technically married. But the marriage is as good as over, and to be honest, Rosa just catches herself daydreaming about having a family and having kids with Albert. Now here's the problem. Albert actually loves his independence. He doesn't want to be tied down, and he also doesn't want any children. And then in August of 2016, Albert took Rosa to the Guardia Civil motorcycle club. So what they would do is they would just meet up on a regular basis and then drive their motorcycles together through the streets of Barcelona. And Rosa wanted to come. The thing is that Rosa hadn't had her driver's license for that long, and it was quite a bit of trouble for her to keep the machine under control and also keep up with the speed of her police colleagues. And so instead of standing by his girlfriend and helping her, Albert completely ignored her that day, and he just drove ahead. The only colleague who shows any kind of consideration to her and is also nice to her is police officer Pedro Rodriguez. So the two start talking and just hanging out. They also flirt a little bit, and Albert remains completely unaware of the tussle that is going on between his girlfriend and his colleague. So Pedro tells Rosa that he's also married, that the marriage is not really going well, and this is basically how it all started. And soon Rosa found herself between two very different men, and she had to make a decision. Does she want Albert, the passionate stud who isn't really down for commitment, or does she want Pedro, who is a little bit quieter, maybe not that popular, but who gives her a sense of stability and security? Rosa chooses Pedro. So Pedro separates from his wife and he moves into an apartment close to Rosas' house. So when Rosa tried to break things off with Albert, without mentioning Pedro, by the way, he didn't really take it well. So allegedly, he was just sitting on the floor the entire time crying and talking to himself. And then all of a sudden, he became quick-tempered and aggressive again. And his reaction frightened Rosa. So Rosa blocks Albert and just rushes headlong into her new relationship with Pedro. But then Albert finds out that she just didn't break up with him for nothing, but for another man. A colleague at that, and when he did find out, he completely lost his shit and he started terrorizing Rosa. So maybe to make him feel better or get him off her case, Rosa decided to unblock Albert, and she tried to reassure him with these sensitive messages, saying things like, "He will never possess me. You are the only one who ever possessed me." Albert, however, is not buying it. And what does he do? He straight forwards these messages to Pedro, saying, "Look at that, look what your girlfriend is writing to me." So Pedro reads these messages and he's completely furious and he storms out of Rosa's house. But the two make up after a couple of days, and a few weeks later, Pedro gives Rosa a ring and asked her to marry him, and she immediately said yes. So for Pedro, this is quite a new start, and his goal is to leave this entire story with Albert behind them. And he really gives his best, trying to be the perfect partner for Rosa. He supports her in the child custody dispute that is still going on with her ex-husband. He also supports her through the trial against her former superior. He even gets her a lawyer, and he also comforts Rosa when she loses the case against her superior. But it is during these days that Albert gets in touch with Rosa again, because he knows that the trial is coming up and that Rosa might be nervous about it. And this is how they started right back and forth a little bit. And at first, Rosa just ignored his messages, but then she eventually wrote back. And a couple of days later, when Rosa was sitting at a restaurant together with a couple of friends, all of a sudden, Albert showed up out of nowhere. And he walked up to Rosa, he put an engagement ring right in front of her, and turned around saying, quote, "In case you change your mind." According to Rosa, she did not change her mind, and she was never gonna do. She made up her mind. She wants Pedro. So she spends the 1st of May together with Pedro, her children, and her parents. They have this beautiful day, and the entire time, Albert is sending her one text message after the other. And so the same day, in the evening, Rosa called back Albert and told him to finally please leave her alone. So it is long after midnight. Pedro retired to the living room in the basement to watch TV. Rosa is on the 1st floor when she suddenly hears the engine of a motorcycle. So she looks out the window and she sees Albert wearing a balaclava and holding an axe in his right hand, jumping over the garden fence and racing towards her. So in a panic, she runs upstairs to her daughters and barricades herself in. All that she can hear are screams and muffled thuds coming from downstairs. And then suddenly everything is silent. And suddenly she hears Albert's voice calling for her to come downstairs. So Rosa walks down the stairs of her house, and Albert gives her a bucket and some cleaning agent and tells her to mop the floor and get rid of the blood. And there's blood everywhere. Pedro is gone. Nowhere to be seen. And intimidated by all of this, she actually starts cleaning while Albert suddenly disappeared in the garage for a couple of seconds. When he came back, he was holding Pedro's cell phone. And he handed it over to Rosa and told her to reply to the last couple messages that Pedro had received to make it look like he was still alive. Allegedly, this is the last thing he did before he just went home. He just left her behind for her to clean everything up. And Rosa, she doesn't look for Pedro. She doesn't call the police. So the following evening, Albert all of a sudden turns up again, this time in his BMW. And he orders Rosa to get in the car. Together, they drive to her ex-husband's house, and now Rosa is supposed to write a last message from Pedro's cell phone, but this time to herself. And this is the message: "Sorry, I don't want to involve you in my problems." After that, they drive back home, back to Rosa's house. So Rosa is supposed to drive the BMW and follow Albert, who is sitting in the VW Golf with Pedro. Together, they drive to this pine forest, and once they were there, Albert all of a sudden pulled out 2 tanks of gasoline out of his trunk, and this is when Rosa panics because she thinks he wants to set her on fire, so she runs off. Only when Perez told her at the garden gate that they found a body in a burned-out VW Golf, she realized that Pedro is really dead. She realized that Albert, her ex-lover, is his murderer and had made her an unwilling accomplice. Now, let's take a look at Albert's version. Albert Lopez had his eye on the beautiful new policewoman Rosa Peral for quite some time. And even better, when they go on duty together, they realize that they have quite a lot in common. Now he actually knows that she is still married and has 2 daughters. It doesn't really bother him that he's just a lover. I mean, he knows that her marriage is not going well, and he also knows that Rosa is totally smitten with him, and he doesn't want to be tied down. And he wants to have fun, which is something that he explains to Rosa every single time she starts talking about family and children again. Nevertheless, the different expectations for this relationship are the reason for them breaking up in 2016. Or so he thought. Because one day in January of 2017, when he drove by Rosas' house to show her his new motorcycle, Albert all of a sudden spotted his colleague Pedro in her bedroom. He was completely thrown off by all of it, and he started writing Rosa these very nasty messages. No, Rosa, she denies her relationship to Pedro, and she tries to reassure Albert, but he doesn't really buy it. So some time passes, and then eventually Albert gets in touch with Rosa again, because he knows that the trial is coming up, and he just wants to know how she's feeling. Suddenly, Rosa confesses to him in one of these text messages that her relationship with Pedro isn't going well. Allegedly, he was violent. Allegedly, he was beating her, calling her names, insulting her, and screaming at her. And Albert sees his chance. So he finds out that Rosa is about to meet some friends at a restaurant for lunch, and so he turns up without further ado. He wants her to know that he's finally ready to commit. And so he gives her this engagement ring. So in the evening, Rosa sends him a picture. She's in a bra and she has her tits up to her ears. She's posing with the engagement ring. And this is how they get back together while she's officially engaged to Pedro Rodriguez. But then, on May the 1st, she suddenly called him on his cell phone in the middle of the night. And Rosa, she was completely beside herself. She was crying, she was sobbing. And Albert asked her what happened. And Rosa told him that Pedro had beaten her right in front of her girls. So she begged Albert to come over, but only when Pedro was asleep. So he arrives at her house around 1 a.m. And Rosa is still crying and sobbing, and he again is the shoulder to lean on. But according to Albert, he left Rosa's house shortly after. The very next day, Rosa called him again begging him to come over. And when he did, she just led him to the garage and opened the trunk of the VW Golf. Now, it took Albert just 1 second to understand what or who was lying in front of him. So Albert slams the trunk shut again and he backs away. Because, according to him, he can't see blood. Albert, completely overwhelmed. He's going like, what did she do? What did she do? So Rosa, she's trying to speak, but she's just sobbing. And then eventually she confessed to having shot Pedro with her service weapon. So allegedly, the fact that he had beaten her right in front of her children was the straw that broke the camel's back. The reason she called Albert was that she needed help get rid of the body. And at first, Albert was like, oh no, forget it. No, you have to turn yourself in. There's nothing gonna happen to you. You were the victim. He was violent. Just turn yourself in. Rosa didn't even listen to him one bit, saying over and over again that she can't take the risk of going to prison. So at her request, he buys the gasoline and follows her in his BMW while she's driving in the VW Golf to this pine forest. And according to Albert, he was just standing there impassively watching her pour the gasoline over the vehicle. So in the days that followed, he tried again and again to convince her to turn herself in, but to no avail. On the contrary, she wanted him to keep quiet and lie for her if necessary. And Albert would later claim that he was literally sick to his stomach when he had to lie to his colleagues when he was interrogated. But he knew that he cannot and will not betray Rosa. But that all changed when she suddenly accused him of murdering Pedro. The trial against the two of them begins on February the 3rd, 2020, and the television crews and teams, they filled up the entire upper gallery. I mean, 2 accused police officers, 1 dead police officer, a love triangle. It is Christmas for the tabloid press. So both of them presented their versions of the story. The prosecution thinks that both of them are just trying to save their asses. The public prosecution is convinced that Rosa and Albert had planned and committed the murder together. So according to the prosecution, when Pedro read the messages that Rosa wrote to Albert, it triggered something in him. He became insecure and he became maybe even a little bit controlling. And he constantly needs reassurance and confirmation from Rosa. And apparently he was insecure for good reason, because in the meantime, Rosa started hooking up with her passionate stud affair, Albert, again. The friends that Rosa had lunch with at this restaurant would later say that Rosa, after Albert had left, was just sitting there and being totally overjoyed, smiling from ear to ear and just posing there with Pedro's engagement ring on the right hand and Albert's engagement ring on the left hand. So it is during this time that Rosa again starts seeing a future with Albert, and Pedro is now in the way. At the trial, the public prosecutor said, quote, "The murder was a diabolical and disgusting proof of love, committed by a woman chasing a fantasy with an emotionally unapproachable man, and committed by a man whose blood boils with jealousy and passion. It is no longer possible to establish what really happened at the house that very evening. The investigators in the public prosecution's office assume that Rosa had mixed sleeping pills into Pedro's food that evening, the 1st of May, and then once Pedro had passed out, she called up Albert, and either Albert, Rosa, or the two of them bludgeoned him to death with a blunt object. The only thing we do know is that Albert bought an axe just a couple of days before the murder. What we also know is that there is actually a sofa standing in the living room in the basement of Rosa's house, because there's a picture hanging in the upper living room of this sofa. But the sofa was suddenly gone when the investigators came to search Rosas' house. And what we also know is that they found splatters of Pedro's blood on the light bulb hanging above the sofa. So after 6 days of deliberation on March 23rd, 2020, the court found Rosa Peral and Albert Lopez both guilty of murder. Albert Lopez was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Rosa Peral was sentenced to 25 years in prison. In prison, Albert wrote a book with the title Presumpción de Culpabilidad, Presumption of Guilt, in which he still maintained his innocence, portrays Rosa as the sole murderer, and depicts himself as a double victim, a victim of Rosa and the justice system. Rosa Peral, oh my goodness, Rosa had to change prisons 5 times until now because she would always clash with other female inmates. She also continues to maintain her innocence, saying that she was prejudged by the court and the media for her dissolute love life. Now, before we finish this case, I have a recommendation for you if you don't have any plans for this weekend. This case was turned into a mini-series and you will find it on Netflix. It's called Body in Flames, and the wonderful, stunning Ursula Cobero plays Rosa Peral in this mini-series, and it is just, mwah, you're gonna love it. So if you don't know what to do this weekend, I got you. And that was case 2 of our video series, Deadly Women. Let me know what you think about this case down below. And if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and leave a comment, give this video a thumbs up. It's always a very nice thing to see. And hopefully I'll see you again in 2 weeks for the next episode. And for this case, we're going to Belgium. I'm really looking forward to that. And in the meantime, enjoy your weekend, try to relax a little bit. And I see you in 2 weeks. Mwah. Kiss and